2 years ago, I co-founded a makerspace at Elon University called the Maker Hub. And if you're wondering what a makerspace is, it's a space where you make things. Makerspaces are labs where people go and they make things that they're interested in making. And you'll actually find makerspaces in a lot of different places. You'll find them at colleges and universities, you'll find them in K-12, you'll find them in libraries and communities around the nation, even abroad. Okay. But all makerspaces, even though they're all different, they all tend to have the same three things in common, and that is that they give people access to tools, supplies, and most importantly, a culture of knowledge and support to make things that they are interested in. And it's that culture of knowledge and support that's really the most important part. That's a group of people within that space who define the heart and the soul of it, who help you figure out how to work through a project, how to get past adversity. So why do we go through the trouble of making a makerspace? What's its purpose? Stick with me. We need to take a little bit of a detour here, okay? Because there are too many students, and I've been in higher ed for over 10 years now. I see too many students who are coming in and they're failing to learn. I don't mean that in the traditional sense. They're not getting D's and F's, far from it. They're getting A's and B's. But their relationship with learning is damaged. It's broken in some way. They're afraid to try new things. They're afraid to go above and beyond. And sometimes they'll even resort to things like cheating and plagiarism. I've seen this illustrated, this fear of engagement with learning, illustrated in a couple of different ways. Most recently, a story that I heard from a friend of mine who runs a makerspace over at UNC Greensboro. And their makerspace is actually in the School of Education, so it's for education majors and minors to learn how to use making with younger students. But they also bring in people from the community. So they bring in administrators, they bring in teachers from the community, they bring in classes from local schools, and they do activities with them to help them learn about what making is and why it can be such a positive thing for their lives. Now, one activity that they really like to do with all the groups is they give them a whole bunch of Lego bricks, and they say, build a house. And you would think that the teachers and administrators, the adults, would be really good at this, because most of them own houses. But they're terrible at it, because they have questions before they'll even put down a single brick. What's the house supposed to look like? Right? This is the adult version of is this going to be on the test? Right? The kids, they just start. They don't have questions. They build houses that are whimsical, creative. This one doesn't even have a roof, right? And it's great. It's really cool. So I'm wondering, what changes? What changes between when you're their age and when you're our age? We see evidence of this in other areas. As the kids like to say, I've got receipts. Because if you look at the research, this pops up all the time. There was a study done a couple of years ago. They talked to instructors who had at least 10 years teaching experience in higher education. And what they would do is they would give them a statement to describe their students, and they would ask them for feedback on that statement. So one of those statements that's really important is, my students recognize the link between effort and success. This is important. We were talking earlier about grit. You do have to persevere. You do have to work hard to get things that are worth having. So when students don't recognize a link between effort and success, that would represent a problem. And so when they gave these experienced instructors this statement and asked them to respond to it, about 52% of those instructors said, my students currently recognize a link between effort and success. That's a really big gap. And on the flip side of that, 46% said, my students' ability to recognize that link has gotten worse over the last decade. One of the other statements from that study that stood out to me was this one. My students are willing to struggle with complicated ideas and theories. Struggle and confusion are absolutely essential pieces of the learning process. They are. Confusion and struggle, that's the sweat of learning. That's how you know it's happening. If you're not willing to struggle, you're saying you're not willing to learn. And when they gave these experienced instructors this statement and asked them to respond to it, only 38% said, yes, my students are willing to struggle with complicated ideas and theories right now. And over half said their students' ability to do that over the last 10 years has gotten worse. And so I think we have a big problem that needs to be solved. Something happens between kindergarten and college. Now, there are a lot of things that do happen in there, a lot of really important milestones, right? You lose your first baby tooth as your first adult tooth comes in. You learn to ride a bike and then drive a car. You have your first crush, your first kiss, your first love. And those are major milestones. You could put a date on most of those. But in between those 2 points, there are tons of subtle little things that happen, often dozens of times a day. Things that kids are exposed to that form little bits of pressure that over time just add up and crush them in certain ways. And this pressure, it comes from so many different places, but if we could pick out 4, it comes from things like the values of the people around them and what they consider to be important. It comes down to things like the heroes that we celebrate in front of children. I think the world of athletics is really a great example of this because we only buy jerseys for the people who are best on the team. Have you noticed that? What message does that send to kids aside from you're only good enough if you're the very best at what you do? Where are they supposed to pull their worth from that? It comes down from things like what kind of compliments we give them. Earlier you were hearing about growth mindset. Some of the research is showing that when we give kids praise in the form of labels like you're so smart, what it tells them is that they have this label that they then become afraid of losing, right? If a parent tells them that they're smart and later they're confronted with a situation where they might have to do something that would make them feel like they're not smart, what are they going to do? Right? And one very big influence in their lives would be standardized tests. And I want to explore this one just a little bit further so you can see some of the subtleties that come along and affect kids over time. Now, standardized tests do seem like a major milestone. We know when they're going to happen. We can put a date on it. Right? If you're a parent in the audience right now, you know when your kid is taking their next test. But here's the problem with standardized tests is they're a really big deal. A really big deal. If you're a student, your scores are going to determine which courses you're enrolled in next year. And coincidentally, who you're going to get to spend time with in class. If you're a teacher, it will determine how much you're paid by your district. If you're an administrator, your school's scores will determine how much money your school is receiving in terms of funding from the state. So these are a really big deal, and instead of just one day a year, we focus on them for a really significant chunk of the school year. And it sends two really damaging messages to students about their relationship with learning. And the first is it tells students that learning is an outcome and not a journey. And that's wrong. It does tell them that failure is a stopping point in there. Right? The other thing that it does is it tells them that most answers are black and white. And we live in a very gray world, right? We know this. But when we tell kids that everything is black and white, then they're either right or they're wrong all the time. And when a situation comes up that challenges them, what do? They run away from it. Because they're afraid. Right? They're afraid. And we get that. Okay. Can we really be surprised that our students fail to see a link between effort and success when we put all of these pressures on them? And over time, these pressures add up, and they create barriers to learning in the form of habits, and not just one or two big habits, but dozens of little habits, habitual responses to situations, even. And we can put these habits under the umbrella of perfectionism. Now, what's wrong with wanting to do well, right? We used to joke, like, what's your greatest weakness? Oh, I'm a perfectionist, right? Psychologists used to actually think that there were positive aspects of perfectionism. But recently, we've determined that all perfectionism is maladaptive behavior, meaning it's damaging. The problem with wanting to do well doesn't exist. We want kids to be high achievers. We want them to set high goals. We want them to strive for greatness. We want those things. The problem with perfectionism comes with how you respond to adversity, how you respond when things don't go your way or when things don't go well. Because in a perfectionist mind, things happen differently. For most people, these are the three outcomes that you could have when you try something new. It either works really well, it doesn't work, or it works well enough. But when you're in the mind of a perfectionist, you lose one of those options. Good enough isn't an option, and success becomes very narrowly defined as something that is absolutely perfect. Imagine what it feels like as a kid to never have anything you do be good enough to yourself, and how that affects them over time. And even worse, it creates an emotional response within them, and one of fear. And fear is one of the most powerful emotions. It's really hard to overcome. It usually creates a fear of being seen as not good enough in some way, not smart enough, not fast enough, not talented enough, right? And when you're afraid of those things, you start to create barriers to situations that might make you feel like you are not good enough, right? And so when you look at kids who are struggling with these things, they are very risk averse. They're hesitant to trying new things. They're worried about how other people will see them. Now, to some extent, we all do this, right? No one wants to look like they're bad at doing something they should be good at. We can appreciate that. But the difference is, when you don't have perfectionism influencing you, even if you have this fear, you'll still do it anyway. But perfectionists will try and avoid potential failure at all costs. And this is an unhealthy relationship with learning. It is. Thanks for sticking with me on that one. So that's our detour. So why a makerspace? Well, again, makerspaces can have a lot of different types of equipment in there. They could have 3D printers, sewing machines, laser cutters, tools, arts and crafts. There could be computers if you're coding apps or something like that. But the most important thing in every space, again, it's going to be that culture, that supportive environment where people are saying, hey, it's okay that your project didn't work out. Let's try and figure out why. Let's try and make it through. And the culture that you find in this place, it promotes something called a maker mindset. And I think the maker mindset is a way forward past some of these perfectionistic tendencies. I think it's a way to help combat them. And to me, the maker mindset is made up of 4 different components. First, makers are intrinsically motivated, so they pursue projects that genuinely interest them. It's not for a class, it's not for a grade, we're not going to judge you. When you come into our space, we're just going to ask you, are you interested in making anything in particular? And if not, we'll just show you some things until you find something that piques your interest. Because if you're not interested in doing it, it's not worth doing in that space. Over the summer, we thought that no one would be in there, but it turns out we found 2 students, Ashley and Olivia, and they were working on a therapeutic boot for diabetics. Because it turns out that diabetics are at risk, in certain cases, of losing their feet when they don't have boots like this. And they actually did such good work on this. I want to point out, this is a project that they just wanted to do. They wanted to do something different for someone else, right? That was their motivation here. They wanted to make a difference. And I think that's really powerful, right? And they were actually so successful in this that they actually just received a $95,000 grant to keep the work going. So I needed to do a quick little side brag for my students. Another thing that makers are really good at is they are very good at knowing what they know and what they can learn. So when you don't know something, it's not a point of embarrassment. It's an opportunity to say, I don't know how to do this yet. Can you show me how? And this is the first maker mindset piece that really requires an emotional investment. It requires some self-awareness, but more importantly, it requires humility to say, I don't know how to do this yet, but also recognizing that you have the potential to grow. Makers also understand that it takes time and effort to make a project great. Perfectionists will be very hesitant to try something they will not be good at right away. But makers understand that it's a very long process. It's not just one and done. You're not just going to get to your first prototype and then it's on to the next thing. We have a student named Madison Tamblin. She was working on a heat sleeve to keep coffee warm for 3 hours after you purchase it. She's gone through about a dozen prototypes before she finally got to the one that worked. Right? It was not the first one that worked out, and that's okay. And the most important part of the maker mindset, the 4th piece, I can't stress this one enough. Makers embrace failure. They do. And I think one of our former student staff said it best when he said, makers don't view a lack of success as a failure. I think we need to recontextualize how we look at failure in general, because we very much consider it to be a bad thing. And we stigmatize it. We make it something that you don't want to be. There's a website called the Noun Project. Their goal is to create a visual representation of every noun. And when I searched for failure, these were the results that I got. Do you see anything positive up there? They even put plane crashes, right? People falling, bugs. Nothing positive on here. But failure to a maker is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to diagnose, where are my soft spots? What do I need to do better? How do I make this better, right? So what do we do about all this? I think there are 3 things that we can focus on through the lens of making that can help improve this and help our kids get back on track. And the first is focusing on process over product. Because if learning is a journey, it doesn't matter where you end up. What matters is what you're doing along the way. The other thing we need to do is we need to change up how we praise people. And I don't just mean kids, I mean adults too, because we already have these habits firmly in place. When we tell kids, you're so smart, what we're telling them is they're done. But when we tell them we're proud of things like effort and how hard they're working, what the research does show is those kids are more successful. They do go on to be higher achievers. And here's the really important part. They're happier. They're happier, okay? Imagine if, instead of just telling someone that they're smart, you tell them that they're a hard worker. Sometimes they need that. Sometimes they definitely need that, okay? And finally, I think we need to reclaim failure. We spend so much time stigmatizing it, saying it's a bad thing. And in educational environments, I'll be honest, as someone who works in education, we don't always do the best job of building and accommodating for failing in our learning environments. We don't accommodate for failure. And we should, because everyone fails, and they fail often. I read about a school district in Chicago. They're getting rid of Fs. You know what they're doing instead? Not yet. They're going to tell kids not yet. Imagine what it would be like to a kid, instead of someone saying you failed, for them to say, not yet. Because not yet is hopeful. Not yet says you have room to grow. Not yet says you can be better, and you're not bad. Right? So we have all these students out here who are failing to learn, and quite frankly, I can't really blame them given the amount of pressures that we put on them from so many different sources. These pressures do create some habits, bad habits. But here's the interesting thing. If you want to learn how to break a habit, here's the easiest way around it from someone who's quit smoking in the past, okay? If you want to break a bad habit, create a good habit that counteracts it. I think that's possible through the lens of making. I think that when you immerse yourself in the process of making things, when you immerse yourself in an environment where people like to make things, where they'll support you in doing that you can start to develop some habits to counteract these things that hold you back from experiences that you're genuinely going to enjoy and help you develop a really healthy relationship with learning. I think the best thing that we can do for these kids and ourselves is to give ourselves a gift, and that gift is learning to fail. Thank you.